The experimental phenomenology of perception is part of an important tradition in the research into psychology in Italy, inspired by and connected to Gestalt psychology, despite some specific theoretical differences. Independently of whether Gaetano Canizza, Paolo Bozzi, and Giovanni Bruno Vicario used the expression the experimental phenomenology of perception or not to refer to their own approach, in effect only Paolo Bozzi used and defended this expression overtly. These three names are the first that come to mind as representative of this school for the generation of researchers into perception, which I also belong to. The names of other scholars will, of course, also immediately come to mind in an order which is most likely related to the geographical origin of whoever is compiling the list. Riccardo Luccio, Walter Gerbino, Tiziano Agostini, Mario Zanforlin, Osvaldo D'Apposo, Luigi Burigana, Alberto Argenton, Manfredo Massironi, Ugo Savardi, and others. Each of them worked according to their own personal interpretation of the approach. They did not shy away from the differences between them concerning certain specific theoretical and methodological aspects, or their willingness towards integrating the perspectives and ideas of other approaches in the cognitive sciences. The various different nuances have often been warmly debated, but there is still a common ground which is evident as compared to other schools of psychology. This common ground can maybe be summarized as follows. A careful investigation of the structure of phenomena is the starting point for all of these maestri and comes before we can talk of perceptual processing or the physiological conditions of perceptual experience or anything else, if ever. For some of them, in fact, a careful investigation of the structure of phenomena is not only the starting point, but it is also final objective. Articles and books are available, and it is therefore possible to study in detail exactly what these maestri meant by carrying out a careful analysis of the structure of the human perceptual experience or of perceptual phenomena, both in terms of theory and methodology. These theoretical premises and methodologies have been forged, meticulously discussed, and are part of a tradition of thought that has already been laid out, even though both theory and methodologies can obviously be developed further. But is this the only way in which the experimental phenomenology of perception can contribute to contemporary cognitive sciences? To put it in other words, is this a complete exploration of how a careful analysis of the structure of phenomena can be important? The mosaic we present here has been created in order to answer these questions. A number of researchers working in different areas of psychology, language studies, philosophy, and art were consulted. This was done in the context of a symposium entitled The Experimental Study of Perception from a Phenomenological Perspective, from Present to Future, held in Macerata on the 6th and 7th of April 2022 and dedicated to Ugo Savardi. All the people interviewed are familiar with experimental phenomenology of perception, or in general Gestalt psychology, either because they have done or still do research in these areas, or because they have encountered it in joint projects or at conferences, or by means of reading about it. We asked each of them to provide a brief message, 90 seconds, explaining why they considered experimental phenomenology to be relevant to their field of study. All these messages form the tiles, which were then put together to form a mosaic, and we think that what results makes a thought-provoking picture. If you take time to listen to the messages in each tile, they will certainly prompt you to reflect on a number of things. And if you click on the link or use the QR code that you see below this video, you can find some suggestions for reading this mosaic, inspired by one possible grouping of the ideas expressed.
I'm Rossana Grosso, and my research field is in visual perception, which I recently extended to include also the visual arts. In the last 15 years, I also conducted several researches in applied psychology in the human-computer interaction domain within the theoretical approach known as user-centered design, focusing especially on user experience. Experimental phenomenology has always been very important for me as a way to conduct research where the focus is the human being. I'm thinking about the human being as both a perceiver, and perceiving implies already an interpretation, and as an actor, because when we perceive, we also prepare to interact with the external worlds. In this perspective, the researches I made, especially in the human-computer interaction domain, took a great benefit from my experimental phenomenological approach. Because user experience is nothing if you do not understand what the user perceives. I remember my mentor, Professor Vicario, keep on repeating that if you want to know what a person perceives or think or remember, you should ask her. This is why experimental phenomenology is so important, because it drives us in framing our experimental hypotheses in a true psychological perspective.
Hi, I am Alessandro Soranzo and I work for Sheffield Hallam University. One of my fields of study is experimental aesthetics. I study what makes an artwork appealing and the phenomenology behind it. The method of phenomenology is fundamental in this area. It consists in a careful examination of how an artwork appears in its single parts and how these parts combine to give rise to the aesthetic experience. Also, the mutual exchange between experimentation and reflection is fundamental for a productive investigation of the aesthetic experience triggered by an artwork. For example, in one of my studies on Leonardo's portraits of Mona Lisa and La Bella Principessa, I used the method of inter-observation to understand the effects, the impact that the expressions of the portrayed subjects have on the observer. I also conducted a phenomenological investigation to clarify what is making these expressions ambiguous. For example, I masked different parts of the portraits in order and measure the effects of this masking into the perceived expression. And using this method, I found out that when the mouth was masked, the expressions didn't look ambiguous anymore. Therefore, realizing that it is probably in the area, in the region around the mouth, that is triggering the famous ambiguous expression of the Mona Lisa.
Hi, I am Daniele Zavagno and I work in the University of Milano Bicocca. My research interests are in psychology of perception, in particularly visual perception, and lately in psychology of art. Of course, my research entails that I study factors and mechanisms underpinning the way we perceive the world, but also the way we experience those special artifacts that are called artworks. At this regard, phenomenology is the general framework within which I conduct my research. I combine it with psychophysics in order to obtain, let's say, rigorous, controlled experimental setups. At this regard, phenomenology has always guided me in trying to understand how we perceive the world and why we perceive the world in a certain way. I hope this may be helpful. Enjoy life.
Hi, my name is Michael Kubovy. My fields of interest are visual perception, auditory perception, the psychology of art, and the structure of lives, among other topics. Now, the reason I think that experimental phenomenology is important is that we are carrying the burden of the behavioristic tradition still in psychology. The way to liberate ourselves from this tradition is to create rigorous observation conditions that are phenomenologically informed, but give the subject, the participant, opportunities to formulate the response without being in a forced choice condition. This certainly applies to perception, all the more so to the psychology of art, and definitely to the structure of lives. Thank you.
I'm Marco Bertamini. I study many aspects of visual perception, especially mid-level vision, shape, grouping, symmetry, and visual preference. Thinking back to my work on perception over the years, maybe I've been scientifically promiscuous, but I can say that I love deeply and sincerely every phenomenon that I've studied, even when I was studying more than one at the same time. Phenomenology is always the starting point of any study of perception. For example, our experience of symmetry drives us to discover it, to attend to it, to include it in our artifacts and artworks. And people have done that well before scientists were able to measure brain activation. Now we can combine these things, identify brain areas, the properties of this network, and how it is affected by attention and by shape constancy. Phenomenology is also the starting point when we study illusions. One striking effect takes place when observers describe a scene with a person and a mirror. Despite what the image shows and our familiarity with mirrors, we have a strong tendency to mistakenly say that the person is seeing her own reflection. Because paintings of Venus provide such a nice example, I call this the Venus effect. Another illusion I discovered more recently is about how we experience an extended texture present both in central and peripheral vision. And small lines become invisible in the periphery when they're part of the textures, although they're visible on their own. Remarkably, we see as non-uniform something that is uniform. I call this the honeycomb illusion. Careful attention to the phenomena can make us discover amazing new things, which then force us to build new theories. The theory and the measurements and the experiments come afterwards. The first step has to be a systematic and careful attention to the phenomena.
Hi, everyone. I'm Simone Gori. I'm an associate professor in general psychology. I'm a neuroscientist working primarily in the field of visual perception. Basically, how our brain actively reconstructs the external world in our mind. Our research team investigates the low-level processes in neurodevelopmental disorders such as developmental dyslexia. We employ experimental phenomenology to demonstrate the causal role of the magnocellular dorsal visual pathway deficit in reading difficulties by measuring motion visual illusion perception. This approach allowed us to have a non-invasive window on the brain mechanism. Thank you very much. Hope you have a good day.
I am Tiziano Agostini, and I do research in perception, and in the last 20 years I try to apply the knowledge I develop, I acquire in the domain of perception also to sport psychology. I think that experimental phenomenology is an important tool to understand how vision works, and applying the knowledge to sport psychology, we were able to find a new method to implement performance by using sound, the sound that is produced by athletes when they move. That sound can be used to as a model to help athletes to reach better performances.
Hello, my name is Heiko Heicht. I teach experimental psychology at the University of Mainz, and I'm currently a fellow at the Wissenschaftskolleg zu Berlin. My take on experimental phenomenology is the following. I'm not sure if I am a culprit here, if I'm certainly experimentally minded. In terms of phenomenology, I'm not so sure. I do work with impressions and subjective impressions, and my areas are from non-contestable visual images that we may have of objects like tables approaching cars and things like that, to very aloof concepts like aesthetic dimensions of pictures or interpersonal distance regulation. I do collect data, I use statistical methods, and in a sense I'm a good experimentalist, but with an emphasis on, well, the implications, the philosophical and practical implications of everyday life, if you will. So let me mention a few areas of interest. One area is the perceptual space that we enter in a way when we look at images, at paintings, say, or photographs, and the relationship of this pictorial approach, pictorial entering into space as it relates to physical space. Are the two spaces compatible? Is a picture in a gallery a break in spatial continuity? And if so, does such a break disappear in a virtual reality environment? Those are questions I'm pursuing. These are of practical and theoretical nature. I also work on simulator sickness a lot. Anything that surrounds virtual reality is dear to my heart. I can be Googled, and you'll find that I've worked on time to contact estimation, on stereo film, film cut, photographs, how to glean information about, say, body height from pictures, and things like that. Well, this should do. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ian Verstegen, and I teach visual studies at the University of Pennsylvania. I do research on the history of art with attention to problems of space and color, and I investigate images as cognitive instruments. I think phenomenology is important because phenomenology is the gateway of experience that all knowledge of art and artifacts passes. I think experimental phenomenology is important because it formalizes scientifically this layer of qualitative experience. Today there is some evasion about phenomenology, and in the interest of affirming direct access to the material world, it is thought that phenomenology is anthropocentric, subjective, or alienating from reality in some way. However, if I stress the materiality of a small medieval crucifix, this is a complex mix of qualities of manipulation and material associations, and the latter are still mediated by experience. In visual studies, it is time to be clear about what materiality exactly means and call much of what we are doing by its proper name. It is phenomenology.
I'm Roberto Burro, University of Verona. I like to call myself a psychophysicist. I think that experimental phenomenology is important because it provides the most appropriate approach for what can be understood as contemporary psychophysics, or better, phenomenological psychophysics. The classical idea of psychophysics is that it is the scientific study of the relationship between the properties of physical stimuli and psychological sensations. For example, you can do a test where you take a physical object, you change its temperature 3 times, and ask a participant to give 3 numbers in order to quantify their sensation of warm or cold. But there are cases in which it is not the physical changes in the stimulus which are important, but how they appear. A particular example of this is provided by the well-known placebo effect. It's not the physical properties of the pill that help the headache go away, but how the pill appears to the person taking it. This is not a case of stimulus error. A stimulus must be in front of the eyes of the subject in order to cause a psychological effect. This is, I believe, an example of experimental phenomenology.
Hi, I'm Ivana Bianchi. I'm interested in perception and grounded cognition, and I do define myself as an experimental phenomenologist of perception. So, needless to say that I strongly believe this approach is crucial for contemporary research. But in the 90 seconds I have, I will not have time to develop arguments to convince you about this. So I will simply point to one aspect that will hopefully help me to show how important phenomenology is for our understanding of perception and cognition on various levels. When we look at the world around us, we immediately see things that are the same, others that are similar to each other, others that are different, and even things that are opposite to each other. This applies to objects. That pair of shoes is the same as those I saw yesterday, or they are totally different from the ones I had in mind that I wanted to buy. This applies to face expressions. I saw a similar look in his eyes last time he was planning something wicked, and it applies to the dynamics of movements too. Look, that car is driving in the opposite direction. We have an immediate understanding of these expressions and consider how important they are, not only for our perception of the world around us, but also for how we categorize it and for the language we use. Now, what are the perceptual conditions that make two things appear to be exactly the same, similar, different, opposite to each other? To answer this question, you need to delve into the phenomenology of these relationships. In other words, you need experimental phenomenology.
Hello, I'm Giulia Parovel, Siena University. My research is on expressive events. The seminal work of Michotte has shown well the power of experimental phenomenology applied to the study of expressive events. Michotte has in fact demonstrated that the meanings such as causality and identity, realness and unrealness can be directly perceived. The launching effect was later extended to other types of causality such as psychological causality and animacy. My proposal is that the experimental phenomenology of causality may lead to further developments such as the exploration of cause-effect incongruities. Being a phenomenon of perceptual grouping based on temporal contingency, it is logically automatic and deeply rooted in the early visual processing. So, we can easily create situations in which we see something perceptually plausible, even if physically impossible. This is a mechanism common in tricks of illusionism, but also in the techniques of slapstick comedy à la Buster Keaton or in Disney-style animating drawings, in which events that are only casually connected appear perceptually connected in a cause-effect relationship, sometimes producing a strong comical impression, providing a new perspective to humor theories of incongruities in psychology and in philosophy.
Hi everyone, my name is Elena Capitani and I am a researcher in general psychology, but I have an educational background that is linked to both philosophy and experimental psychology. I deeply believe that experimental phenomenology of perception is fundamental for two reasons. Firstly, because models can be considered valid only insofar as they are adequate explanants of their explanandum. And the explanandum here is the perceptual phenomenon as it occurs under observation. Therefore, we really cannot do without a fair description of the phenomenon, And it has important implications also for the philosophy of knowledge and ontology. But today I would like to focus on another aspect that concerns the applied value of phenomenology for product design and development. The experimental phenomenology of perception indeed tells us not only when we like something, as the method of analysis of physiological indices, for example, but why we like something, why that object, a net or a pair of shoes, for example, appear to be striking or ordinary, modern or classic, elegant or sporty. What are the visual characteristics that are associated with these expressive characteristics? This is intriguing in itself, but it has, obviously, also important implications for the world of design and marketing. So, is there a need for the experimental phenomenology of perception? Yes, of course, and on many different levels.
My name is Carla Canestrari, and I am interested in the study of humor. Experimental phenomenology has widely contributed to this area since the 1930s, when Schiller and Meyer referred to a configurational theory of humor. In particular, it has helped in the investigation into the structure of the configuration of humorous texts. In the 90s, Metz-Göckel and Smith overtly connected their analysis of humor to the classic perceptual laws of Gestalt. In more recent years, what we know about contrast as a visual phenomenon has been used to better understand how contrast works in humor. Contrast is a key element of humor, since humor plays precisely on creating and then solving an incongruity. So in 2000, Colson and O'Brien distinguished a number of different types of verbal irony, for example, contrast of kind or contrast of magnitude, and they placed the underlying mechanisms to these in relation to two well-known perceptual phenomena, cross-contrast and assimilation. Hyperboles and understatements use contrast of magnitude, and therefore the assimilation phenomenon, while classic irony plays on a contrast of kind, enhancing the perception of difference as in a visual contrast phenomenon. In recent years, I have also been working with some colleagues from the Experimental Phenomenology of Perception Lab in Macerata and Verona to show that the rules underlying the perception of opposites as a perceptual phenomenon help to explain how people understand humor and irony. In conclusion, experimental phenomenology has in many ways revealed the important intersubjective conditions that make something humorous.
Hi guys, we are from the University of Macerata, Italy. I am Andrzej Zuczkowski in Polish and Zuczkowski in Italian.
I am Ilaria Riccioni. I am Ramona Bongelli. Our research field concerns language and communication, and specifically in the last 20 years we have been working as a group and applying phenomenological analysis, that is Paolo Bozzi's observation method, to written text and spoken interaction, considered as organized wholes, Gestalten.
In particular, we have focused on pragmalinguistic analysis of specific conversational sequences, for example, trouble-telling sequences, narrative sequences, complaining sequences, and so on, as well as on speakers and writers' epistemic positions concerning their knowledge, unknowledge, and uncertainty.
We think that this observation method is fantastic because first, it allows to work in group. Second, it allows researchers through their dialogue to express, disclose, share their impressions, opinions, suppositions, and so on the specific object under observation. For example, a transcript of a conversation. And finally, it usually allows to achieve an intersubjective agreement among researchers, which is qualitatively richer and deeper if compared with subjective observations.
Hello, I'm Dirk Geeraerts. I'm Professor Emeritus of Linguistics at the University of Leuven, and I've done a lot of work on lexical semantics and language variation. theoretically, I have a strong link with cognitive linguistics, and that cognitive linguistic orientation is also what triggers my interest in phenomenology, for two reasons. First, a central feature of cognitive linguistics is its interest in linguistic conceptualization and categorization through and in language. But crucially, these cognitive phenomena are seen as grounded in experience. And accordingly, there's an obvious affinity with phenomenologically inspired psychological research, like the experimental phenomenology tradition, a tradition that takes its starting point in the analysis of a lived experience. And beyond that, I'm also intrigued by the more philosophical side of phenomenology, because one of the sticky problems in cognitive linguistics is the tension between largely universal bodily experience and highly variable sociocultural experience. And I can see that reflected in different strands of phenomenological philosophy. So there too, I believe that cognitive linguistics can profit from a close encounter with phenomenology.
I'm Carita Paradis, and I'm Professor of English Linguistics at Lund University in Sweden. I do research on meaning and language, and I'm particularly interested in the basis of the dynamics of meaning-making in natural language. My research is situated in the broad framework of cognitive linguistics, more precisely in cognitive semantics, which some researchers in the field see as a branch of phenomenology. From the point of view of my research, experimental phenomenology is important because it centers on how content is experienced by humans. And what I'm interested in is the relationship between situated human experiences and the recontextualization of experiences through language. In other words, I'm interested in the relationship between the psychological processes proposed by cognitive psychologists and phenomenologists, such as contrast, salience, and comparison, and the choice of language resources related to those processes.
My name is Joost van der Weijer. I'm an associate professor of general linguistics at the University of Lund in Sweden. I work at this university in the Humanities Lab, which is a national infrastructure for the study of human behavior. The lab is used by researchers from various disciplines, such as linguists, psychologists, and cognitive scientists. Most studies are carried out in the laboratory setting and are therefore quantitative and experimental in nature. My personal interest is language behavior. As a non-native speaker of Swedish myself, I'm interested in the acquisition and perception of a second language and in the role of language input on the acquisition process. I have encountered the field of experimental phenomenology through internal and external collaboration. A particularly attractive characteristic of this field is that it combines multiple methods to obtain answers to questions about human experience of everyday phenomena. With that, I think that it will provide us with interesting results that will challenge existing knowledge and will open up to new questions to be answered in future research.
Hello there, my name is Linden Ball and I'm a professor of cognitive psychology at the University of Central Lancashire in the UK. My interest is in meta-reasoning, which concerns the processes that monitor and control our thinking when we're engaged in tasks such as reasoning, decision-making, and problem-solving. On the one hand, metacognitive monitoring processes function to evaluate the efficacy of ongoing thinking, thereby determining whether we're on the right track toward a good outcome or whether we need to try a different strategy. On the other hand, metacognitive control processes take their cue from information at the monitoring level to terminate failing strategies and to initiate new ones. But how does meta-reasoning relate to experimental phenomenology? I contend that experimental phenomenology is central to understanding the operation of meta-reasoning processes, which have an inherent experiential dimension to them. Take metacognitive monitoring, which I would argue is experienced phenomenologically as a shifting state of certainty regarding how well a process is unfolding. Moreover, such experienced certainty can readily be captured through subjective measures such as feelings of warmth or feelings of rightness. Another way in which metacognitive certainty is manifest is in the language that people use when asked to think aloud when reasoning or when communicating during collaborative task performance. Research indicates that the use of hedge words such as maybe or perhaps provides a sensitive index of subjective uncertainty that is linked to subsequent strategy change. In sum, I believe that the emerging field of meta-reasoning research provides a fresh impetus for deploying the methods of experimental phenomenology to afford a deeper understanding of how subjective feelings of certainty and uncertainty drive effective thinking. Thanks for listening.
Hi, I'm Amory Danek, a cognitive psychologist from Heidelberg University in Germany. My research interests are insight, problem solving, and memory. I'm particularly interested in the phenomenology of insight, the subjective aha experience that people sometimes report when they solve difficult problems. This emotional reaction has different facets, such as pleasure, confidence that the solution is correct, and the feeling of suddenness. I'm interested in the impact that aha experiences have on memory. I also investigate under which circumstances aha experience might signal truth or correctness of a solution and when they might mislead us, so-called false insights. I think experimental phenomenology is important because we need to go beyond reaction times to fully grasp the richness of the human experience. Especially for phenomena in higher cognition, subjective experience should not be regarded as too soft for hard science. In the case of insight problem solving, there has been a movement towards considering its phenomenology much more in recent years. Instead of just focusing on the cognitive component of insight, restructuring, it is time to take into account the affective component as well, by obtaining direct records of solvers' subjective solution experience. This has become a very fruitful approach. I consider myself as a neo-Gestalt psychologist, and my aim is to revive the Gestalt approach to insight in a modern version here in Europe.
Hi, I'm Erika Branchini. I'm interested in the psychology of thinking and reasoning, in particular in spatial insight problem solving. I think that experimental phenomenology is fundamental when we talk about space representation, and also if we want to describe the path our thoughts follow when we are engaged in problem solving. It helps us to understand the mental representations of the problem that we immediately create. It helps us to understand the elements that seem to be initially indispensable and that conversely actually create an obstacle in the process. And those elements which are initially non-salient but then at a certain point become prominent and lead the problem solver in the right direction. In other words, it helps us to see the differences between the various mental representations of the problem and the final representation leading to the solution. To sum up, if you want to understand how spatial representations really work in insight problem solving, you can't do it without taking phenomenology into account.
What does phenomenology have to do with psychometrics? Well, if you're undergoing an examination involving, say, an fMRI scan, the fact that you think that the fMRI machine can actually pick up the very small changes in your blood flow and map your brain's responses to the stimuli you're presented with is unlikely to make a difference in the quality of the data collected, is it? But if you're taking a psychological test, be it an intelligence test or an SAT or a personality questionnaire, your attitude toward the test can make all the difference in the world. The perception of the test by test takers goes by the name of face validity, and it's about whether the test actually appears to measure what it purports to measure. If a respondent, for whatever reason, thinks that the test is not valid, regardless of the technical validity or the accuracy of the measure, the resulting negative feelings and attitudes toward the test may lead to inaccurate responses and/or lack of commitment, thus jeopardizing the results of the test. Believe it or not, some authors do not consider face validity as a proper kind of validity of a test, and some others do not consider it at all, since for them, if evidence supports its content, criterion, and constant validity, there is no need to care about a layperson's opinions, just as with any other objective measurement instrument. But hasn't someone suggested that there is not always an agreement between what we perceive and what we know about the world?
Hello, I'm Federica Biassoni and my research interests are traffic psychology and communication psychology. I'm doing research on risk perception, and I think that experimental phenomenology is important to better understand the processes of risk perception and risk assessment. Plenty of studies have shown that when evaluating a risk resulting from an hazard, people rely on some characteristics of the hazard that are directly, immediately accessible via a global and affective perception. In a certain sense, I would say that risk perception by naive people is very different from risk perception by experts, because the first one relies on the hazard affordances, while the second one relies on the calculation of probabilities. An interesting example of this is that well-known and familiar stimuli are deemed as less dangerous than the new ones.
My name is Fabrizio Bracco, and my research areas of interest are human factors and psychology of safety. I think experimental phenomenology is important because its methods could be useful in the investigation of human performance in socio-technical systems. Think about hospitals, factories, and transports. Accident investigations often highlight the heavy contribution of human performance to the mishap in terms of errors and violations. However, due to the highly technical nature of these systems, the investigation is often focused on objective data stored in monitoring devices, for instance, a black box. Operators are often asked to describe their behaviors, the output, and not the reasons behind it, the psychological determinants. Investigations underestimate the personal, phenomenological perspective of the people involved, and this leads to a poor picture of the complex situation. Just like guessing what happens during a football match, simply standing outside of the stadium and listening to the crowds shouting. Another factor that may benefit from experimental phenomenology intuitions is due to the hindsight bias, which affects the accident investigators. In hindsight, we build a different story than the one taking place in the mind of the operators before the event, because we highlight only the factors, decisions, and cues that led to the event, and disregard all the other factors that were present in people's mind. Again, it is a phenomenological neglect that does not give value to the most relevant element for system safety, the human being. Thank you.
Hello, I am Gerhard Stemberger, a Gestalt psychologist and psychotherapist from Vienna, Austria. The second and major part of my professional life has been devoted to practicing, researching, developing and teaching Gestalt theoretical psychotherapy in Austria, which is not the same as Gestalt therapy, by the way. I think experimental phenomenology is important for many reasons, especially so for my field of work and expertise. In a certain way, psychotherapy is experimental phenomenology in action, not in the laboratory, but under field conditions. The psychotherapist tries to help people to get a better understanding of themselves and their situation and what might help them out of their distress. That sounds easy, but not always is. Sometimes one has to be very courageous and inventive to get a clear picture of one's own situation. One important way to do so is to experiment. It has been said, if you want truly to understand something, try to change it. This is the way of exploration in psychotherapy, applied experimental phenomenology in a single case. Perhaps not always in a strictly scientific sense, but what might be even more important in a real-life sense. Such a real-life setting is a huge challenge for a scientific approach, but I think experimental phenomenology has no reason to shy away from such a demanding task. Goodbye. Have a good life.
I am Arianna Fermani, and I do research into the history of ancient philosophy, more specifically Aristotle. Aristotle concerned himself closely with phenomena, which in Greek means what I see, what appears to me. He explicitly said in his work on ethics that when a phenomenon and a theory contrast with each other, the phenomenon wins. Phenomena are for him both the starting point and the end point of any theoretical investigation. He often reminds us to open our eyes without getting lost in useless theories. Those who are in doubt about whether snow is white or not need simply to look at it. We read in Topics 1:11. Similarly, he replied to the question of why we like conversing with beautiful people by asking, "This is the question of a blind man." Beauty was surely for him a matter of visibility, of phenomena, and beauty was a visible idea, not only for Aristotle, but for Plato too. So everything we learn from the experimental phenomenology of perception about the conditions under which we perceive beauty, or the conditions that make things appear as they do, is important for us too. We are given a new lens to look at the world of phenomena, to notice details, and this stimulates us to consider things in a new light. For instance, we have found the results of the studies carried out on experimental phenomenology relating to the perception of opposites and intermediates extremely stimulating, since these are central issues for Aristotle. So, a lot of interesting overlaps.
I'm Carla Danani. My research interests are in philosophy. I try to understand in depth the relevance places have for human beings and for societies. I believe experimental phenomenology is important for its close reference to human experiences, for it strives to grasp the ways in which experience happens, and the many ways in which the world is given. It helps to highlight that human beings are not living in the world, but on it, because they feed on it. Through experimental phenomenology, it is possible to highlight the many relationships that bind human beings to each other, to their context, and to non-human, artificial, and natural alterities. Philosophy has to question its basis and ways of inquiry, and to interpret about meanings and the implication of its results. But anyway, written work can be done.
Greetings. My name is Richard Davis, and I teach what's known as theoretical philosophy at the University of Bergamo in Italy. And this means that I'm allowed to tamper with the main areas of philosophy which tradition teaches are logic, metaphysics, and ethics. But my interest in the work of Paolo Bozzi was spurred in the first instance by his researches into naive physics, understood, if I understand it aright, as the mismatch between, for instance, what we're taught at school about the trajectories of objects in free fall and the ways that we trace for ourselves the paths taken by projectiles. What most intrigued me was the fact of the mismatch between the official theory and how we experience such phenomena. Bozzi also extended this to the perception of objects such as chairs and jam jars, or particularly the jam in the jars, considered as wholes, or indeed as wholes that mean something, rather than just as constructions out of the sensory data that philosophers often talk about. But perhaps what I found most liberating about Bozzi's writings as a whole is his sure-footedness in moving back and forth between his laboratory work with experimental subjects and his employment of those results to interrogate views that have become, as it were, commonplaces among philosophers and psychologists, from Democritus down to William James and beyond. And that's why I want to promote the works of Paolo Bozzi.
I am Roberto Casati. I am a philosopher of the cognitive sciences. I worked most of my life on strange objects or limit cases objects which are interesting to phenomenology and the cognitive sciences because they test our basic cognitive forms. And right now I'm working on a very special object, maybe an object which is too large for our cognition. This is the ocean. And I'm interested in bringing the ocean to the fore of philosophical, phenomenological and cognitive investigation. The ocean has been neglected by phenomenology and the cognitive sciences for too long a time, possibly because it is a background for a figure. The land has always been a figure or human activities. So the challenge for me is to turn the object into a figure and at the same time understand what it is for the land to become a background. The ocean as a figure and the land as a background. So maybe it's too early to have experiments on that, but at least we can try to have a good phenomenology of those phenomena.
Hello, my name is Michael Oellinger. I'm an experimental psychologist. I'm a lecturer at the Ludwig-Maximilians University in Munich and a research scientist at the Parmenides Foundation. Parmenides was a pre-Socratic philosopher who was interested in the notion of thinking. For me, thinking is the field for phenomenological experience. Without subjective experience, without processes that appear from thinking and that participants could report our models on thinking and further theories on thinking would be impossible. We need hard data as well as subjective experience to get a better grip on the complicated notion of thinking. And in the next step, it would be interesting whether we can inform artificial systems with phenomenological experience. Of course, we have to be aware about the limits and the boundaries and the constraints of subjective experience. Thank you.